So hey, quick peek behind the sausage making. Some of the first half of this audio was actually written and recorded to be part of an upcoming episode of This Movie Exists, which may or may not run in the near future or not so near future because Halloween season's coming up and a whole different genre of content kinda has to take precedence at that point, and also it made the front of the show a little long and kinda wandered off topic, so I cut the tangents out and turned it into its own thing here for optional cross-promotion. So let's see if we get them both out in something like a reasonable time frame. It seems today you hear a lot about filmmakers, or quote-unquote showrunners, supposedly hijacking a project and turning it into something it was never meant to be, the accusation usually being aimed at creators from certain backgrounds who've been hired onto big franchise IPs and then changing them to push an agenda, which, yes, is the outlook, understanding, and language, if you can call it that, of people who barely even qualify as people in the evolutionary sense of the word, but for sake of argument, does that scenario or anything like it ever actually happen? Because it's one of those dumb ideas that even though you can generally assume that it's not happening because that's just not how movies or anything works.
Wait a second, I thought Banky and Holden created this shit.
And I'm stealing it. I'm taking it back for the black man to make up for all the shit that you motherfuckers have taken from us.
Like, they don't just have whole finished movie or TV shows all planned out and then some purple-haired woke boogie woman out of Ben Shapiro's self-hating dry dream fetish nightmare tricks someone into hiring them and then she injects the liberal queer genes into it and it becomes a whole other thing just before it gets to air, and no one else in the studio or business at any point in the production knows anything about it, can prevent it if they wanted to. Like, that's just not how anything works, but it almost, if you squint and then hit yourself in the head enough, sounds like a version of it might possibly in some stupid universe be plausible, right? Like, maybe you'd even like it to be plausible or possible in one direction or another for a particular creative person with a particular vision to take over a production and covertly turn it into their own thing as a way to get their vision out or send a message or even just to fuck with people for the hell of it. You know, like in the third act of Tim Burton's Ed Wood movie, where Ed essentially tricks the investors of Plan 9 into making the movie in order to realize his own vision and honor the memory of Bela Lugosi after getting a pep talk from Orson Welles. That's almost total fiction, by the way. That's a great movie, probably still Tim Burton's best, but it has very little to do with what's known of Ed Wood's real life, the production of Plan 9, which is fine. It's not really a biography, but yeah. In any case, auteurs, would-be, wannabe amateur filmmakers running away with a project has happened, right? Like, we've heard of this, or versions of it. Everybody kind of knows that Stephen King hates the movie version of The Shining, although that's really not a running away thing. The studio approved Kubrick's version of the movie. It was King who was basically the odd man out, whether you agree with him or not. On that same line, yeah, you know, it's weird that people don't talk about this more because neither guy ever says it out loud, but if you read between the lines, it seems really likely the reason we keep getting these fucking awful Hellboy reboots instead of Hellboy 3 was because Mike Mignola really didn't like the two Guillermo del Toro movies. Which is a shame, and you know, there's the famously contentious Making of Apocalypse Now, where Francis Ford Coppola's finished movie was very different in its tone and politics from John Milius' original script, and during the production they kept shooting deeper and deeper into the jungle, in part to prevent the studio from seeing what they were doing and stopping them, and the director and editor were at one point holding pieces of the footage hostage from each other. That was a whole thing. Now, I guess if I'm reaching, I'd say that something like the Broadway musical version of Annie fits into the real version of this paranoid framework. If you don't know the full angle on that one, short version, the creator of the Little Orphan Annie comic strip, was almost psychopathically devoted to hardline capitalist social Darwinism and hated FDR's New Deal policies, so he pretty much killed off his rich guy hero character, Daddy Warbucks, to protest the New Deal, and then resurrected him when FDR died. Talk about petty, but in the musical, FDR is a good guy hero, and there's a song about how the New Deal was great and saved the country, so now the only version of Annie that anyone cares about or remembers in this century is basically a giant fuck you to the weirdo that created the property. And I guess you can count Starship Troopers, where Paul Verhoeven basically takes a very pro-war, pro-military, join the army, learn to be a grown-up and kill shit, it's good for you, and anyone who doesn't shouldn't get to vote book from Robert Heinlein, and makes a dystopian self-satire where all the props and background stuff keeps shouting, hey, does this remind you of Nazis? Because it reminds me of the Nazis, about the material he's adapting. But, you know, just like Annie, the producers paid for that version. They knew what they were getting when they hired the same screenwriter and same director as RoboCop.
I'm doing my part too.
So this is not remotely what, say, I don't know, butthurt, whiny Star Wars weirdos are filling their diapers about when they imagine Kathleen Kennedy or whoever grabbing whatever they think the Acolyte or Ahsoka or Outlaws or whatever else should have been and going, mwahaha, I took all your Star Wars and now I'm gonna twist it around and fill it up with I don't actually know what they're mad about anymore. Women, black people, both? Did they not like the Space Beaver? How can you not like the Space Beaver?
Oh shit, a talking beaver!
But yeah, the woke hijacking thing, that just doesn't happen. It doesn't. There's no real meaningful precedent for a movie where the production set out to deliver some rock-ribbed, all-American, traditional values, stalwart vision, only for it to be seized, for better or worse, by a sneaky trickster filmmaker at the helm manipulating the final product into something exactly the opposite, and then it's too late to do anything. There's just too many different levels of yes and no to sign off on even the smallest production for it to work like that. This is why, again, better or worse, the most common complaint about big Hollywood movies today, from the people who know what they're talking about at least, isn't that they're bad or incompetent, but that they're bland and boring. That they go through too much quality checking and double checking, so that while they're too polished to be actually all that bad, they're too second-guessed to be truly great. We're not really drowning in shit, but we are treading water in lukewarm good enough.
It's not that good, but it's not that bad.
It's so-so. Yeah, more or less.
And in cases where it's just a non-politically baffling misfire, your basic how did something like this even happen bad movie escaping containment example, like a Batman v Superman where a studio tries to retroactively pin the misfiring on a filmmaker going rogue or having too much auteur control. Even auteurs have checks and balances as a matter of practical reality. The studio was not surprised when Zack Snyder handed in that movie. They were thrilled with it. They got exactly the movie they paid him for. The now defunct Warner Brothers of 2016 was psyched about that movie and 100% confident they had just released a $1 billion Avengers killer to theaters right up until the moment it set a record for the worst opening weekend box office drop-off in the history of the genre. Then it became only one guy's fault.
My mommy's name is Martha, too.
Thing is, I actually do know of exactly one movie where a filmmaker really was, supposedly, hired on to develop and direct a film based on a famous intellectual property, literally ran off during pre-production to do some other stuff before returning, committing, and completing the actual movie, after which the studio and producers discovered they should have been paying much closer attention to what he'd been doing between I'm gonna go on walkabout before we make this and I'm back, rested, and I got this, guys, because what he delivered no longer bore hardly any resemblance to the material they'd paid to adapt, and instead was a lengthy treatise on the filmmaker's newly awakened but very committed ideological and spiritual beliefs rendered with very expensive special effects. But now here's the thing, this cinematic hijacking, the one and only time a rogue creator took a whole production and warped not only the film itself but the beloved property it was based on into a whole other thing, reflecting their personal obsession and crusade, not about woke politics, or unwoke politics, or internet drama, not even about taking shots at dead comic strip writers to remind everyone about the New Deal. So what was it about? Like, what did happen?
Drugs?
I'll have to say drugs, too.
Well, you can learn the full story of that movie, 2004's Blueberry, also known as Renegade, by checking out my full breakdown of that all-time big-budget French cowboy disaster piece as part of our new series, This Movie Exists. Check the link in the description. Unless, of course, we haven't been able to post it yet, or YouTube has decided to fuck us in the Content ID bullshit again, in which case, check again, it'll be there eventually, but please support the Patreon because, wow, it's getting hard to make an honest living in this racket. So anyway, why was this bullshit on my mind? I mean, this kind of stuff isn't ever really not on my mind, unfortunately, but this specifically to the point where I went on about it at length at the beginning of a whole other thing so much it turned into this episode. Yeah, well, some of it was just coming off people being weird about this Star Wars game because they made the main character look, I guess, like kind of a Sigourney Weaver in the first two Alien movies, 80s sci-fi tomboy chick. And there's this whole thing now where hyper-political gaming YouTube channels throw tantrums if female characters don't look like anime jailbait, and it's pointless to engage the merits of that discourse because most of those guys are lying, the rest of them are subliterate morons that the liars feed disinformation to for a living, and both sets are probably more comprised of Russian robocall drones than actual people at this point, so who fucking cares? I know, but what got my antenna up more than usual is the prevalence of this dumb conspiracy copy pasta about uglification in games that now crops up all across social media that claims the last decade or so of modern AAA gaming tends to have not great face animations, which, okay, sure, you're not going to get me to argue that hyperrealism, uncanny valley everywhere thing doesn't generally suck.
These days it's not about collecting cans of cream corn and childish platforming. Now it's all DLC and microtransactions and fuck you. Do you want a chicken nugget?
But this dumb conspiracy claims that this is actually a bad-on-purpose thing because supposedly an ideological movement that hates classical beauty and traditional gender roles has taken over the entertainment business, and every design decision, especially how women dress and look in games and movies that angry young dudes don't like, is actually this deliberate scheme to break down the societal fabric by making men less masculine and women less feminine. And yes, this is somehow very much all the gays and feminists and transgenders' fault. And, do these people hear themselves talk? I mean, rhetorical question, but at a certain point you'd think, wow, we all sound like fucking idiots, would somehow seep in there, right?
What the hell is wrong with you people?
Now, obviously, 90% of this is just anger merchants shaking the can for YouTube money. You have to tell your audience that there's a big, implacable, nebulous enemy coming to wreck up their stuff so they stay frightened and angry and keep listening to you. It's the same play Fox News and Talk Radio make with the migrant caravan stuff, the they're coming for your gun stuff, the trans bathroom stuff, now the they're eating your pet stuff. I feel like most people grasp this pretty easily, and even some of the stupid ones grasp it, but they think their taxes are gonna go down somehow, so they, look the other way. But that's a whole other thing.
You're not rich. True, but someday I might be rich, and then people like me better watch their step.
Like I said earlier, it's kind of hard to actually produce this movie sucks or this game sucks content now based solely off the fact of things actually just sucking, because there's so much content, and even the lower end variety is so relatively polished and widely available that the worst that you can usually say is, well, this is uninspired. And I mean, no wonder so many of these guys have started just saying racist shit hoping that sticks, because what else do you do for clicks when your only move is base lizard brain rage-a-hol? Be creative, think of something else. I mean, small digression here, if you'll permit me, in a piece that is already mostly entirely digression in a series that is arguably entirely that as well. Something that stood out to me in recently revisiting the work of James Rolfe, the angry video game nerd, as part of another recent episode, was for a series that can be very much credited as the founding document of the YouTube angry reviewer genre, how relatively innocent and non-confrontational the material is to almost anything but the nebulous idea of bad games as a player experience, and even then more from memory and cultural absorption. There's no real attacks on other types of gamers, no sincere savaging of what it is and isn't a real game, and even hating on bad companies like LJN treated them like nebulous personifications of corporate logos than going after specific developers, calling out game journalists. And to be clear, most of that was unquestionably because Rolfe was and remains really talented and never needed to reach into cruelty or cheap tacky politicization for material, but also just like how comedy commentary shows like Mystery Science Theater or Riff Tracks usually got more mileage out of truly obscure, ultra cheap gonzo stuff like Manos or Birdemic than regular, more recent bad movies, the older games the AVGN show mainly focused on were generally bad and broken in weirder, more interesting, more unique ways. There's just more jokes to tell with stuff like that. I mean, speaking as a currently working film critic, there's only so many ways to say this movie is just fine when the default state of most recent movies, lesser, more, or whatever, is this is just fine, and still come up with interesting ways to reframe it.
It's not that good, but it's not that bad.
But what sticks out to me more in regards to the subject at hand is the need with this current crop of fake rage baiters for all of it to be a conspiracy, the projection of organizational opposition. It can't just be that a design decision was made that you strongly dislike for whatever reason. It has to be that there's some organized, coherent, ideologically coalesced movement marshalling against you and yours for nefarious purpose. And the persistence of this sticks out not simply because it's a classical building block of fascism, Umberto Eco's point number 8, the enemy is both weak and strong, but also because it's so unnecessary in this context. If you've already identified the specific individual thing you're mad at and the reasons why, and in this case you've got more than enough existing systems responsible to rail against, be they specific design philosophies, I mean real ones like hyperrealism, photorealism, desaturation, anything as opposed to the wokeness or whatever you think Sweet Baby does that they definitely don't do.
Fake.
Or, corporations that would at least qualify as the direct decision makers. Again, I'm not asking why Star Wars Theory or Mark Kern or Chris Gore spread conspiracy bullshit. You know why they do it, to make money off gullible morons. I'm asking why gullible morons buy into it. Because it feels to me like this projection of a need for something to feel like it means more than it does because you're embarrassed that you care about it one way or another. Like they know I prefer all my video game women to look like a specific jerk-off ideal and now fewer of them do, and that pisses me off, is a sort of pathetic opinion to hold very strongly, so they have to cobble together this absurd Harrison Bergeron fantasy about sinister forces trying to make everyone accept mediocrity and beauty standards, so it sounds like they're taking a policy stand that's somehow less sad. But guys, I gotta tell you, it's not. It's so much more sad. And you need to remember you're hearing that from a man who has owned multiple installments of DOA Extreme Beach Volleyball and has the DOA movie on multiple formats of physical media.
I appreciate the expansive multi-tier environments and the rich plot development. Seriously, why else would I play it? She kicks eye.
Because I mean this in all sincerity, you are allowed to just not like a thing. Yes, even for a gross, petty, or socially frowned upon reason. You shouldn't need either the false pretense of fighting an ideological enemy that doesn't really exist, or the stalwart backup of ideological allies that it's supposed to summon by implication. And speaking only for myself, I would respect these people more, however minutely and if only in theory, if they would just, I guess, be self-contained individuals with their own singular bad opinions on racism, gender, whatever, than trying to join or conjure some kind of unified theory where every disparate weird hang-up of dozens of angry dudes is all caused by some collective enemy force. Like, just stand up on your own and own your bullshit. You're allowed to be a racist or a sexist or phobic of various things. You're not allowed to act on that in ways that hurt or abridge anyone else's life, but that's true of anything, and you do also have to deal with it, i.e. most other people are probably going to dislike you and call you out, but that's life, kids. Grow the hell up. You don't have to invent a new political party or put up flyers for a fake little funeral. What the fuck was that about, by the way? Are you the little rascals? You gonna hold a goddamn bake sale next?
There are dozens of us. Dozens!
Look, if you are feeling somehow guilty about your opinions, like, when I say out loud that too many black people in Star Wars bothers me or that women shouldn't exist in media, if I'm personally not sexually attracted to them, I feel uncomfortable with myself, maybe investigate that feeling in a self-critical way, absolutely, personal growth. But also, you can hold bad opinions. It's not against the law or something. You're not covering yourself by dressing it up as a complex ideological struggle against an enemy that doesn't exist. You are, in fact, free to be a sleazebag, a bigot, a misogynist, a racist, even just an asshole. And I and everyone else am free to tell you to fuck off about it. I'm Bob, and that's the big picture.